The rain in North Yorkshire did not fall. It drifted in heavy, horizontal sheets that smelled of low tide and rotting fern. Arthur Pendelton adjusted the collar of his tweed coat, his boots sinking into the choked, untended grass of the old rectory's garden. The house behind him, St. Jude's, was a severe, narrow-shouldered Georgian structure of soot-stained millstone grit. For 40 years, it had sat empty, a dark tooth rotting quietly in the gums of the valley. To the diocese, it was a liability. To Arthur, a man who restored ecclesiastical properties with a surgical, joyless precision, it was an inheritance of silence. Or so he had thought. He found the well at the western edge of the orchard, where the dead plum trees clawed at the gray sky like arthritic fingers. It was older than the rectory, built from unmortared river stones that had turned green and slick with liverwort. A massive slab of Westmoreland slate capped the opening, secured by a rusted iron strap that looked like a permanent scar across the stone. Arthur knelt. The air around the wellhead was unnaturally still, devoid of the damp wind that whistled through the orchard. He cleared away a clump of wet ivy, his fingers brushing against the cold slate. There was a gap no wider than a silver coin where the iron strap had warped away from the stone. He didn't know why he did it. Perhaps it was the crushing weight of the isolation or the lingering bitterness of his recent divorce, a quiet catastrophe that had left him hollowed out. He leaned down, his lips almost touching the wet slit in the stone. The air escaping from the gap smelled of ancient silt and something faint, iron-like and cold. "I didn't care when she left," Arthur whispered into the blackness. The words felt heavy, shameful, and small. "I felt absolutely nothing." He waited. No echo returned. The dark stone simply drank the sound, leaving only the patter of rain against his wax jacket. Arthur stood, wiped his muddy knees, and walked back to the house, pushing the brief moment of vulnerability from his mind. The interior of St. Jude smelled of cold lime and ironstone. Arthur had set up a Spartan workspace in the old morning room, a trestle table, a single copper lamp, and a camp bed that creaked under his weight. Exactly 30 minutes later, Arthur stood at the porcelain sink in the scullery. A solitary brass tap hung over the basin, green with verdigris. He turned the cross handle. The pipe shuddered, a violent metallic asterisk clank-clank-clank that vibrated through the floorboards before delivering a thin, rusty stream of water. He cupped the cold water in his palms and splashed his face. As he leaned down to rinse his mouth, the water pressure dropped. The steady stream thinned to a ragged drip. Thump, thump. Then came the breath. It didn't sound like a human voice at first. It sounded like the wet, scraping hiss of air escaping a waterlogged leather bellows. It rose directly from the black cross of the drain strainer, a wet vibration that stirred the stagnant water in the trap below. Nothing. Arthur froze, his face inches from the porcelain. The copper lamp on the wall flickered, its flame dipping until the shadows in the corners of the scullery elongated like reaching arms. The voice was thin, dry, and perfectly dry-throated, despite emerging from a wet iron pipe. It bore the exact, clipped cadence of his own voice, yet it sounded old, as if his words had been dragged through miles of wet gravel before reaching the surface. "I felt absolutely nothing." The final word died with a soft, bubbling hiss, followed by the sharp, metallic asterisk tink asterisk of a single drop of water hitting the copper drain. Arthur recoiled, his spine slamming into the lime-washed wall behind him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at the sink. The drain was silent now. The thin stream of rusty water resumed its flow, splashing innocently against the white enamel. "An echo," he muttered aloud, his voice sounding thin and unconvincing in the empty house. "The plumbing, a resonant cavity, a pneumatic fluke." But he knew the layout of the rectory's pipes. The well water was disconnected. The scullery tap was fed by a modern header tank in the attic. There was no physical connection between the stone shaft in the orchard and the lead pipes behind the kitchen wall. None at all. By midnight the storm had worsened. The wind howled off the moors, rattling the heavy sash windows in their rotten frames. Arthur lay on his camp bed, the wool blanket pulled up to his chin, staring at the ceiling plaster. The house was not quiet. Old buildings never were, but St. Jude's possessed a peculiar acoustic anatomy. The cast-iron radiators that lined the hallways didn't just hiss, they groaned. Clank. Arthur turned his head. The radiator at the foot of his bed was cold. The boiler hadn't been fired up in a decade yet. The iron pipe rising from the floorboards began to vibrate. It was a rhythmic, scratching sound, like a fingernail dragging along the inside of the metal. He sat up, his skin prickling with a cold, greasy sweat. From the safety valve of the radiator, a tiny jet of cold air hissed out. With it came a sound that made Arthur's stomach drop. It wasn't his own voice this time. It was a woman's voice, high, reedy, and laced with an old, brittle panic. "The baby isn't breathing, Thomas. Look at his fingers. Why are they blue?" The voice didn't come from the room. It came asterisk through asterisk the iron. It was followed by a wet, choking gasp, then the distinct rhythmic sound of a rocking horse creaking on uneven floorboards. Creak, snap, creak, snap. Arthur flung himself out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold, bare joists. "Who's there?" He shouted into the dark hallway. No answer, only the wind. He grabbed his heavy iron flashlight and walked out into the corridor. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet soot and old, stagnant water that seemed to be sweating from the very wallpaper. He followed the sound. It wasn't just the radiator in his room. As he passed the upstairs washroom, a low, collective murmur drifted out from beneath the door. Arthur pushed the door open. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, landing on an ancient, clawfoot zinc bathtub. The tub was dry, filled only with a scattering of dead woodlice and flakes of rust. He stepped closer. The copper waste pipe beneath the tub was vibrating so violently that the floorboards beneath it hummed. From the open drain of the tub, 3 voices were speaking at once, their words overlapping like threads in a rotting shroud. One was a man, weeping dryly. Another was a young girl, her voice flat and monotonous. The third was a wet, clicking sound that had no human shape at all. He took the money from the vestry box. £3, £3. Under the floorboards by the chimney, they'll never look. Don't let him put me in the ground yet. I can still hear the birds. Arthur dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the linoleum, its beam spinning wildly, illuminating the underbelly of the sink, the lead pipes, the dark corners where the damprot had taken hold. The voices didn't stop. They were rising now, growing louder, fuller, as if the water in the traps was bubbling with them. The sound was spreading through the walls, rising up from the baseboards where the old pipework ran, turning the entire timber skeleton of St. Jude's into a giant, whispering throat. He knelt to pick up the flashlight, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp the metal casing. As his fingers closed around it, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to have died. Then, from the small basin sink in the corner of the washroom, came a single, clear, and perfectly distinct sound. It wasn't a whisper. It was the sound of someone swallowing a thick mouthful of water. A voice Arthur had never heard before, low, wet, and terribly close, spoke from the drain. It didn't use the old-fashioned syntax of the dead parishioners. It used his name. "Arthur," the drain rasped. "You forgot to tell the well about the summer you turned 12. You forgot to tell it about what you left at the bottom of the gravel pit." Arthur's breath hitched. A cold, physical sickness surged up his throat. That was a secret he had never spoken aloud to a living soul. He had never written it down. He had barely even allowed himself to think it in the daylight. The drain whistled softly, a sound like a small child drawing air through a broken tooth. The flashlight beam trembled against the porcelain basin, scattering fractured arcs of white light across the water-stained wallpaper. Arthur did not move. He could not. His boots felt as though they had been poured full of lead, anchoring him to the vibrating floorboards of the washroom. The smell had changed. The sterile scent of old lime and copper had evaporated, replaced by the choking, alluvial stench of stagnant river silt, pondweed, and ancient, unwashed wool that had rotted in the dark. From the dark circle of the sink drain, a small bubble of black, brackish water rose, wobbled, and popped with a wet, flat snap asterisk. How do you know that? He was speaking to a plumbing fixture. The absurdity of it hit him like a physical blow, yet the terror was heavier. A suffocating weight pressed against his breastbone. The drain did not answer immediately. Instead, a low, rhythmic vibration started deep within the wall behind the sink. It was the sound of water traveling through ancient, calcified lead, not a steady flow but a rhythmic, pulsing thud-thud, thud-thud that perfectly matched the acceleration of Arthur's own pulse. The pit was deep, wasn't it, Arthur? The voice returned. It was louder now, no longer a soft rasp but a wet, fluid friction of words, as if the speaker's mouth were perpetually filling with cold grease. The water at the bottom was green, like glass, and Toby couldn't swim. Arthur stumbled backward out of the washroom, his shoulder hitting the door frame so hard the old iron latch rattled. He fled down the narrow hallway, his bare feet slapping against the cold, unyielding joists. The dark house seemed to expand around him, the corridors lengthening into shadow, the ceiling lowering like a coffin lid. He slammed the door of the morning room behind him, throwing his weight against the heavy oak panels. He slid the brass bolt home. It was an illusion of safety, a childish reflex. The walls themselves were lined with the very iron and lead that carried the infection. The copper lamp on the trestle table sputtered, its wick drowning in oil, casting long, frantic shadows that danced across his technical drawings and architectural blueprints. Arthur sat on the edge of the camp bed, his hands pressed tightly over his ears. It did not help. The sound didn't need the air to reach him. It vibrated through the timber of the bed, through the soles of his feet, directly into his skull. In the corner of the room, the ancient cast-iron radiator began to cough. It was a dry, choking sound, like an old man trying to clear phlegm from a throat lined with rust. Ha-ack-tink, ha-ack-tink. "You ran," a voice hissed from the radiator's pressure valve. It was a chorus this time, 3 distinct timbres of his own 12-year-old voice, layered over one another in an unnatural, dissonant harmony. "You didn't scream for help. You didn't run to the farmhouse. You ran to the woods. You sat under the briars until your shins bled, and you watched the crows until the sun went down." "Stop it," Arthur whispered, pressing the heels of his hands into his eye sockets until brilliant, painful stars bloomed in the darkness behind his eyelids. "Stop it! You're an echo. You're a trick of the acoustics." "We aren't an echo, Arthur," the radiator whispered back, the iron pipe beneath it glowing with a faint, cold condensation that began to bead and run down the metal like greasy sweat. "An echo only repeats what it is given. We expand. We digest. We have been waiting in the dark below the orchard for a long, long time. The parish grew so quiet after the rector died. No one speaks to the stones anymore." The house was waking up entirely now. From the floorboards beneath his bed, the muffled weeping of the Edwardian woman returned, her grief now frantic, her voice breaking into short, wet shrieks. From the hallway, the rattling of the zinc tub's waste pipe grew so violent that Arthur could hear the mortar crumbling inside the wall cavity, dropping down between the studs with the sound of spilling teeth. He couldn't stay in the room. He couldn't stay in the house. Arthur grabbed his leather boots, shoving his cold, damp feet into them without socks, and pulled his waxed jacket over his bare torso. He seized the iron flashlight. The metal casing felt unnaturally heavy, almost alive, vibrating in his palm with the same sickening frequency as the pipes. He threw back the brass bolt and lunged into the corridor. The air in the hallway was freezing now, visible as thick, gray plumes of breath before his face. But it wasn't his breath alone. The flashlight beam caught dozens of tiny, wispy jets of steam escaping from every seam in the wallpaper, from every iron nail head, from every gap in the wainscoting. The house was exhaling. As he reached the top of the stairs, the great iron water tank in the attic directly above him groaned. It was a massive, riveted cube of Victorian iron that held hundreds of gallons of rainwater. The sound that came from it was a deep, resonant boom, the sound of something massive shifting its weight beneath the surface of the water. Thump! The entire staircase shook. Arthur lost his footing, his boot slipping on a patch of black condensation that had pooled on the landing. He tumbled forward, his knees striking the hard oak stairs as he slid down the flight, the flashlight clattering ahead of him, its beam painting the spinning walls in nauseating streaks of yellow light. He landed heavily at the bottom of the stairs, the wind knocked from his lungs in a sharp, painful grunt. He lay there for a moment, the taste of copper and dust thick in his mouth. Directly in front of his face was the base of the scullery wall. The plaster had completely failed here. It was soft, waterlogged, and bulging outward like an abscess. From the dark gap between the stone foundation and the rotten timber sill, a thick black fluid was slowly welling up. It wasn't oil and it wasn't mud. It was water so dense with ancient organic matter that it moved like syrup. And from that wet slit in the house's skin, 100 voices were speaking at once. They were no longer separate. They had been compressed, mashed together by the weight of the earth below into a single, terrifying wall of sound. It was the collective registry of every shameful thing ever whispered into the well since the foundations of St. Jude's were laid. "I poisoned the black mare. She took 3 days to die. The child came out twisted, so I put it in the dry wall. I don't love him. I want the fever to take him before winter. Arthur, Arthur, Toby's shoes are still down there. Under the silt, they're full of tiny snails." Arthur scrambled to his feet, gasping for air that felt thick and wet, like breathing through a damp cloth. He threw his weight against the front door of the rectory. The heavy iron key was stiff in the lock. It turned with an agonizingly slow **clack**. the metal freezing against his bare fingers. He threw the door open and broke out into the night. The storm was absolute. The wind hit him like a physical fist, tearing the hood of his jacket back and driving the cold rain directly into his eyes. But the cold was clean. The air didn't smell of the drain. He ran blindly through the long, choked grass of the front garden, his boots churning the earth into gray mud. He didn't look back at the house, but he could hear it. Even over the roar of the gale, the plumbing of St. Jude's was screaming. The lead vents on the roof were whistling like panicked steam trains. The downspouts were gurgling with a rhythmic, choking laughter. He reached the iron gate that led to the road, his hand closing around the wet metal latch. He stopped. The road led to the village, 3 miles away across the pitch-black moors. But as he looked out into the darkness, he realized the sound wasn't just behind him. From the ditch beside the road, a stone-lined culvert meant to divert the hill water, came a familiar, wet rasp. "Where are you going, Arthur?" the ditch whispered. The water rushing through the grass beneath the gate hummed with the cadence of his own voice. "Every drop of rain that falls on this hill goes into the limestone. Every ditch leads to the beck. Every beck leads to the river, and the river goes everywhere." Arthur looked down at his own hands. They were dripping with rainwater. His jacket was soaked. His hair was plastered to his forehead. The dread that settled over him was no longer a creeping feeling. It was a physical paralysis. The well wasn't just an object in the garden. The well was the mouth of an underground sea of secrets, an aquifer of human misery that had been rising beneath his feet for centuries. He turned slowly, his eyes drawn back toward the dark silhouette of the rectory. The house stood like a black monolith against the moving gray clouds. Every window was dark, yet from the western side of the property, from the old orchard where the dead plum trees grew, a soft, pale light was pulsing. It wasn't a natural light. It was the cold, phosphorescent glow of wet rot, rising from the gap in the Westmoreland slate cap of the well. Something was pushing the slate aside. Arthur could hear the terrible, scraping shriek of iron straps sliding over stone, a sound that cut through the thunder like a razor blade through silk. The slate was moving. The well was opening itself from the inside. The scraping of the Westmoreland slate was a slow, agonizing punctuation mark in the roar of the storm. It was the sound of a tooth being dragged from a socket, calcified, stubborn, and ancient. Arthur stood frozen at the perimeter gate, his fingers locked around the iron bars. The metal was so cold it seemed to fuse with his skin, but he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the orchard. Through the driving rain, the pale, bioluminescent glow from the wellhead grew wider, casting long, skeletal shadows from the dead plum trees. The branches looked like frantic hands reaching up from the earth, trying to claw their way out of the mud. A heavy asterisk thud echoed across the garden. The slate slab had fallen from the rim, fracturing against the river stones below. The well was fully uncovered. The silence that followed was instantaneous, dropping over the rectory like a heavy wool shroud. The wind still whipped the tops of the ash trees, and the rain still fell, but the sound of them was gone, swallowed by the open throat in the orchard. The only acoustic reality left was a deep, rhythmic suction, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated inside Arthur's sinuses. Hoo-wah! The well was breathing. It was drawing the cold Yorkshire air deep into its belly, then exhaling a mist that smelled so strongly of iron filings, turned earth, an old bone that Arthur had to cover his mouth to keep from retching. Arthur! The voice did not come from the house this time, nor from the ditch at his feet. It came from within his own chest, a sympathetic resonance that rattled his ribs. It was his mother's voice, dead 12 years, but it possessed none of the gentle warmth he remembered. It was sharp, brittle, and laden with the smell of the damp linen she used to wrap around his throat when he was feverish. "You never told them about the kitchen matches, Arthur. You let the scullery maid take the blame. She was dismissed without a character reference. She died in the workhouse at Caister. You knew that, didn't you?" Arthur's knees buckled. He dropped into the mud of the driveway, his hands sinking into the freezing mire. "I was 7, he sobbed into the dark. "I was only 7. "The well doesn't care about the years, Arthur." A different voice answered, the gravelly tone of the old village blacksmith who had died when Arthur was a boy. "The stone remembers the weight. Every word is a pebble dropped into the dark, and the bucket is coming up." From the center of the orchard, a wet, rhythmic rattling began. It was the sound of an iron chain winding around a wooden windlass. Clack, 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 clack. The well had no windlass. Arthur had examined it earlier. It was a flat-capped stone ring flush with the earth. Yet the sound of the chain was undeniable, heavy and metallic, rising from the subterranean darkness. With every clack asterisk, the pale light blooming from the shaft grew brighter, shifting from a dull, phosphorescent green to a thick, milky white that smelled of tallow and river fat. He had to look. A horrible magnetic compulsion pulled at his spine, dragging him up from the mud. It was the same sick curiosity that had drawn him to the edge of the gravel pit 40 years ago, watching the bubbles rise from the green water where Toby's cap floated. He couldn't run. The water in his clothes was heavy, pulling him toward the orchard like a tide. He stumbled through the broken wicket gate, into the high, wet grass. The briars tore at his bare legs beneath his coat, but the pain was distant, muted by the thrumming in his head. As he reached the first row of dead trees, the chain sound stopped. Clang. A heavy iron bucket had hit the stone lip of the well. Arthur stopped 10 feet from the rim. The air here was warm unnaturally, feverishly warm and thick with steam that carried the sound of 1,000 overlapping whispers. The steam rose from the wellhead in gray, curling ribbons, wrapping around the trunks of the plum trees like wet bandages. He looked into the well. The water was not 60 feet down. It had risen to the very top, nearly brimming over the green river stones. It was completely still, a black mirror reflecting the turbulent sky above, but the reflection was wrong. The clouds in the water were not moving with the wind. They were swirling clockwise, a slow, viscous vortex, and suspended just beneath the surface of the black water were faces. They were not ghosts. They were shapes made of the silt and pondweed itself, their features formed by the shifting patterns of the mud. There was the Edwardian mother, her mouth a dark, hollow circle of clay. The blacksmith, his whiskers made of tangled root fibers, and a dozens of others, and genealogy of parish sins, preserved in the cold, anaerobic dark of the limestone aquifer. In the center of the vortex, a small shape was rising. It was a boy's school cap, made of heavy gray wool, waterlogged and bloated. Beneath it, 2 pale, hairless hands emerged from the silt, their fingers long and translucent like the roots of a willow tree. The fingers clutched at the stone rim of the well, their nails long since replaced by tiny black pond snails that clicked against the river stone. Tink, tink. "Arthur," the silt boy whispered. The voice didn't come from the water. It came from the scullery sink inside the house behind him, echoing through the open front door and across the lawn like a long-distance telephone call. "You didn't give me your hand then. Give it to me now." Arthur looked down at his right hand. The skin was pale, mapped with blue veins that seemed to be pulsing with a dark, muddy fluid. He could feel it now, the plumbing of his own body, the veins and arteries, the chambers of his heart, all vibrating at the exact same frequency as the iron pipes in St. Jude's. He wasn't separate from this place. He had drunk the water from the well when he arrived. It was inside him. The hands at the rim shifted, the willow root fingers flexing. From the dark house behind him, a massive sound erupted. The iron water tank in the attic had finally burst its rivets. Hundreds of gallons of stagnant water roared down through the ceilings, a thundering waterfall that smashed through the plaster, cascading down the stairs and bursting through the ground floor windows in a violent torrent of foam and splinters. The water rushed across the lawn, a dark, freezing wave that swirled around Arthur's boots, pulling him toward the wellhead. The boy's face rose above the surface of the water. It had no eyes, only two smooth gray hollows filled with clear, trembling bubbles. The mouth split open, a dark slit that smelled of the deep gravel pit, and from it came a sound that Arthur had kept buried for 40 years. It was the sound of Toby's lungs filling with water, a wet, rattling whistle that would never stop. Arthur leaned over the edge, his face inches from the silt child's face, his balance tipping over the black water. The freezing torrent from the exploded attic tank swirled around Arthur's knees, a violent current thick with chunks of rotten lath, gray ceiling plaster, and century-old dust. It didn't flow away from the well. It spiraled toward it, falling back into the stone throat from which all things in this valley came. Arthur was on his knees now, the cold river stones of the wellhead biting into his shins. His hands were braced against the slick rim, his palms resting only inches away from those pale, willow-root fingers. The boy's face, formed of smooth, anaerobic silt and bound by weed, stared up through the trembling water. A bubble rose from the dark slit of its mouth, expanding until it mirrored Arthur's terrified eyes, then popped with the sound of a small, wet stone dropping into mud. "You thought the valley forgot, Arthur," the voice came, echoing not just from the scullery drain behind him, but from the very water rushing past his thighs. It was a chorus of the drowned, their voices pitched to the low, grinding frequency of shifting limestone. "Nothing is forgotten. The rain collects it all. Every lie told in the parlor, every cruel word muttered in the dairy, it all filters through the soil. It collects in the dark. We are the weight of your parish." "I was a child," Arthur choked out, the skin of his face tightening as the feverish steam from the well condensed on his cheeks, freezing into thin, saline crusts. "I didn't mean to let him sink. I was afraid." The fingers on the rim flexed. A tiny black pond snail detached from the boy's fingernail, tumbling into the vortex of the well with a sharp, clear clink. "Fear is the heaviest stone of all, Arthur," the voice rasped. It was his own voice now, but aged, withered, as if spoken by an version of himself that had spent 40 years rotting at the bottom of a cistern. "And you have been carrying it for so long. Let it go. Drop it in." A sudden, violent tremor shook the garden. Behind him, St. Jude's Rectory groaned as the structural timbers bloated and heavy with decades of damp, and the sudden catastrophic weight of the burst water tank began to settle. The western wall, built of severe millstone grit, fractured. A long, zigzagging crack tore through the limewash, looking like a branch of black lightning in the flash of the storm. With a sickening crunch, The iron downspouts along the eaves tore free from their brackets. They didn't fall to the earth. They twisted, writhing like dying eels in the mud, their lead joints snapping as they redirected themselves. The open ends of the pipes crawled across the grass, tracking toward the orchard like sightless hounds following a scent. From the dark interiors of those broken pipes, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. It was no longer the neat, distinct secrets of individual dead parishioners. It was an unholy, domestic static, the combined, unfiltered malice of 100 homes, 1,000 broken marriages, 10,000 hidden shames. The sound bled into the earth. The very mud beneath Arthur's knees began to hum, the vibration traveling up his leg bones, settling into his pelvis, his spine, his jaw. His teeth clicked together rhythmically, mimicking the asterisk clack-clack-clack of the unseen windlass. He couldn't pull his hands away from the stone. The water in his wool trousers, his heavy tweed coat, his waxed jacket, it wasn't drying. It was pulling. The capillary action of the fabric was working in reverse, the moisture drawing him down toward the brimming water. "Please," Arthur whispered. His vision was darkening at the edges, the pale, phosphorescent light from the wellhead filling his entire field of view until the world was nothing but green rot and black water. The silt boy reached up. A hand made of wet roots and gray clay closed around Arthur's right wrist. The touch was not cold. It was burning, a dry, chemical heat like quicklime. Where the fingers touched his skin, the blue veins beneath his flesh expanded, turning dark, almost black, as they absorbed the brackish water pulsing from the entity's grip. Arthur could feel it entering his system, the ancient, calcified history of the rectory's soil flooding his bloodstream. He saw the image of the scullery maid, her face hollowed by the workhouse winter, staring at him from the back of his own eyelids. He felt the phantom weight of 3 stolen pounds in his pocket. He felt the cold, heavy iron of a fireplace poker striking flesh in an Edwardian bedroom he had never seen. The house behind him gave a final, resonant shudder. The morning room window, where his blueprints and tools lay shattered outward, a fountain of glass shards and black water bursting into the night. The water was rising over the lip of the well now, a thick, greasy sheet that spilled over Arthur's hands and into the mud. The vortex in the center widened, a dark, vertical shaft that seemed to cut straight through the limestone foundations of the county, down into an absolute, lightless sea. The boy's face drew closer, his wet, gray forehead almost touching Arthur's nose. The bubbles in his empty eye sockets popped one by one, releasing the distinct, unmistakable scent of the gravel pit, the smell of stagnant water lilies and old, waterlogged wool. "There's room at the bottom, Arthur," the boy whispered, his voice finally coming from his own mouth, a wet, rattling gasp that filled Arthur's throat. "There's room for everything you never said." Arthur's balance failed entirely. His shoulder dipped past the stone rim, his face tilting down toward the black mirror where the faces of the parish waited, their mouths open, ready to drink his final breath. The transition from the screaming night to the interior of the well was a descent into an absolute, suffocating density. Arthur did not plunge, he sank. The black water did not splash around him. It closed over his head like a heavy, velvet fist, extinguishing the roar of the storm, the grinding of the rectory's foundations, and the mechanical screech of the iron downspouts in an instant. There was no air, yet Arthur did not choke. His lungs did not burn with the instinctual panic of the drowning. The fluid filling his throat, his nose, and his ears was not common rainwater. It was the thick, calcified sediment of a century's unuttered grief, a liquid history so heavy that it held him perfectly suspended in the dark. He was floating in the throat of the aquifer. The pale, phosphorescent glow from the wellhead was far above him now, a small, trembling circle of green light that looked like a coin dropped into a deep pond. Beneath him, the vertical shaft of the well did not end. It opened into a vast, subterranean cathedral of limestone, a black sea whose ceilings were held up by pillars of ancient, dripping stone. He was not alone in the dark. As his eyes adjusted to the bioluminescent rot that drifted through the water like underwater snow, Arthur saw them. Thousands of them. They were suspended at various depths within the great limestone reservoir, the residents of the valley who had died with their secrets locked behind their teeth. They did not move. They hung vertically in the black water, their limbs limp, their hair floating around their heads like halos of dark silk. To his left, the Edwardian mother drifted, her hands still clasped together in an eternal, frozen prayer. Beside her was the village blacksmith, his leather apron stiff and heavy with mineral crusts, his mouth slightly open to reveal a tongue made of green river moss. There were children in Victorian pinafores, old men in smocks, and young women in bridal shrouds that had turned the color of river fat. They were all connected. From the mouth of every figure ran a thin, translucent tube of braided silt and root fibers. These tubes twisted through the water like a vast, underwater nervous system, coiling and knotting together until they formed a massive, central column that rose straight up into the stone neck of the well. They were feeding the house. Every secret, every unconfessed horror, every hidden malice was a drop of oil rising through the lead and iron conduits of St. Jude's, turning the rectory into a living, breathing monument to human shame. A hand touched Arthur's cheek. It was Toby. The boy was floating directly in front of him, his gray wool school cap missing now, revealing a skull made of smooth, polished river stone. His willow-root fingers were gentle as they brushed the saline crusts from Arthur's eyes. The voice that spoke did not use sound waves. It vibrated through the fluid in Arthur's own inner ear, deep and resonant. "You are home, Arthur. You don't have to build things anymore. You don't have to scrape the lime from old walls or fix the rotted joists. The house is finished." Arthur looked down at his own torso. His tweed coat and waxed jacket were unraveling, the wool threads stretching out into the dark water to join the great braided column of silt. His skin was turning the color of the limestone around him, a pale mineral gray. The blue veins in his wrists had hardened into thin, leaden pipes, pulsing with the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the aquifer. "Is this where we stay?" Arthur thought, his mind projecting the question into the cold silence of the pool. "This is where the weight goes," Toby answered. The boy's clay mouth did not move, but the water around him rippled with the words. "The valley cannot carry it above the ground. The sun is too bright for it. The soil is too thin. It must live down here under the roots of the orchards until the limestone turns to dust." Far above, a catastrophic rumble vibrated through the water column. The western wall of St. Jude's Rectory had finally collapsed. Arthur could feel the shockwave, a distant, thudding boom that sent a cloud of white lime dust drifting down through the neck of the well like a shroud of snow. The iron water tank in the attic, the lead plumbing behind the morning room walls, the zinc bathtub, the entire mechanical skeleton of the house was tumbling into the cellar, folding in on itself in a final, metallic embrace. The connection was broken. The throat of the well constricted. The great column of root fibers and silt began to unravel, its upper tendrils snapping as the house above died. The faces of the floating parishioners shifted slightly, their expressions softening from terror into a flat, monotonous peace. The weight was no longer being drawn upward. The reservoir was closing its gates. Toby smiled a slow, horizontal fracture in his clay face. He extended his hand one last time, his fingers weaving between Arthur's leaden ones. "Let go of the breath, Arthur," the boy whispered. Arthur Pendelton, restorer of churches, keeper of unuttered silences, opened his mouth. He did not blow bubbles. He did not struggle. He simply allowed the final, cold pocket of air in his lungs to escape a single, silver globe that rose through the dark, tracking toward the green circle of the wellhead far above. As the bubble broke the surface of the pool, the Westmoreland slate slab did not slide back into place. The ruins of the rectory fell over the orchard, burying the well under tons of soot-stained millstone grit, sealing the aquifer in absolute, permanent darkness.